The flickering fluorescent light cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls of interrogation room 6. Jason Winters stood perfectly still, watching his subject through the two-way mirror. His cold blue eyes reflected nothing as he studied the man handcuffed to the steel table. After 15 years as a CIA interrogator, Jason had mastered the art of patience. He knew every tell, every micro-expression that betrayed a lie. His colleagues called him the machine behind his back, not just for his effectiveness, but for his complete detachment from the emotional aspects of his work. The suspect before him was a mid-level operative suspected of coordinating attacks on American embassies. He'd been holding out for 36 hours, but Jason could see the cracks forming. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted to the corners of the room, classic signs of someone about to break. Jason adjusted his crisp white shirt cuff and checked his watch. The black site facility hummed with its usual quiet efficiency around him. Located 3 stories underground in an undisclosed location, it was a place where time seemed to stop, where the outside world ceased to exist. The perfect environment for his work. Director Catherine Powell appeared beside him, her sharp features illuminated by the harsh light. "How long?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. They'd worked together long enough to skip the small talk. "Another hour," Jason replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of experience. "He's already showing signs of psychological fatigue. The sleep deprivation is working." Catherine nodded, her gray suit immaculate as always. "Good. We need what he knows about the Belgrade operation. Make it happen, Winters." As she walked away, her heels clicking on the polished concrete floor, Jason felt a familiar sensation settle over him. The cold focus that preceded every successful interrogation. He'd lost count of how many suspects he'd broken over the years. Each one had their breaking point. It was just a matter of finding it. But lately, something had been different. The work that had once seemed so clear-cut had begun to blur at the edges. In the dead of night, when sleep eluded him, Jason sometimes found himself thinking about the faces, all those faces that had sat across from him in rooms just like this one. He pushed those thoughts away. Doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. The facility had changed too, though in ways so subtle most wouldn't notice. The corridors seemed longer, darker. The air felt heavier, as if charged with some unseen energy. Jason had dismissed these observations as products of too many hours underground, too much coffee, too little sleep. But they persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. Last week, during a particularly intense session, the lights had flickered in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. The suspect, a hardened mercenary who'd shown no signs of cracking, had smiled suddenly, as if privy to some private joke. When Jason asked what was so funny, the man had simply whispered, "They're coming." He'd died of an apparent heart attack hours later, that same mysterious smile frozen on his face. The official report cited natural causes, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something else had been at work. He'd seen men die before. It came with the territory, but never like that. Never with such purpose. A knock on the observation room door pulled him from his thoughts. Agent David Cooper, one of the newer additions to the facility's staff, stood in the doorway. His usually composed face showed signs of strain. "Sir, we've just received word from Eastern Europe. They've got him." Jason didn't need to ask who him was. For the past 6 months, every intelligence agency in the Western world had been hunting Vladimir Sokolov, a former Russian operative who'd gone dark after a string of mysterious incidents. The official story was that he possessed critical intelligence about an imminent attack on American soil, but the way the higher-ups talked about him in whispered conversations, the way they'd mobilized resources usually reserved for the highest-level threats, it suggested something more. "When does he arrive?" Jason asked, already mentally preparing for what would likely be his most challenging interrogation yet. "Tomorrow morning. Director Powell wants you to handle it personally." Cooper hesitated, then added, "Sir, there's something else. The team that captured him, 3 of them committed suicide within hours of the operation. No explanation, no notes, they just did it." A chill ran down Jason's spine, though his face remained impassive. In all his years of service, he'd never heard of anything like that. Something about this entire situation felt wrong, like a puzzle where all the pieces fit but the picture made no sense. "Get me everything we have on Sokolov," Jason ordered. "I want to know every detail, no matter how small." As Cooper hurried away, Jason turned back to the mirror, but his mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow. The suspect in front of him now seemed almost irrelevant, a mere prelude to what was coming. In the reflection of the glass, he caught a glimpse of his own face and noticed something that disturbed him. For the first time in years, he saw uncertainty in his eyes. The overhead light flickered again, and for a moment, just a moment, Jason could have sworn he saw something move in the shadows behind him. But when he turned, there was nothing there, just the empty observation room and the soft hum of the ventilation system. He told himself it was just fatigue, just his mind playing tricks after too many hours in this windowless maze of corridors and cells. But deep down, in a place he rarely acknowledged, Jason Winters felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time: fear. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this fear was justified. In less than 24 hours, he would come face to face with something that would shatter his understanding of reality. The true horror wasn't just coming, it was already here, waiting in the shadows, watching with patient, ancient eyes. And it was smiling. The morning brought a storm, sheets of rain hammering against the facility's surface entrance. Jason stood in the loading bay, watching as the unmarked transport vehicle backed into position. Water dripped from his dark overcoat, creating small puddles on the concrete floor. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. 4 armed guards emerged from the vehicle first, their faces tense. Then came Vladimir Sokolov, shackled and wearing standard prison orange. But there was nothing standard about him. Even in chains, he moved with an unnatural grace, his tall, gaunt frame seeming to float rather than walk. His black hair hung in wet strands around a face that might have once been handsome, but now looked like a sculpture left out in the rain too long, all sharp angles and deep shadows. When Sokolov's eyes met Jason's, something passed between them, a recognition that went beyond the usual dynamics of prisoner and interrogator. Sokolov's lips curved into a smile that made Jason's blood run cold. "Agent Winters," Sokolov said, his voice carrying a thick Russian accent and something else, something older. "They told me you would be here, the famous interrogator who breaks everyone." He tilted his head slightly, studying Jason with eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "But who breaks the breaker, I wonder?" One of the guards shoved him forward, but Sokolov's smile never wavered. As they led him away to the holding cells, Jason noticed that the overhead lights dimmed slightly, as if recoiling from the prisoner's presence. Director Powell appeared beside him, her face drawn. Initial reports say he hasn't said a word since his capture, just that smile. The transport team is already requesting psychological evaluations, something about nightmares. Jason nodded, his mind already formulating strategies. "I'll start in an hour. Standard approach first, then we'll escalate as needed." "Be careful with this one, Winters," Powell said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "There's something different about him. The reports from his capture, they don't make sense. The way they found him, just sitting there in an abandoned church in Kiev, surrounded by dead birds. Hundreds of them, all arranged in perfect concentric circles." "Birds can be explained," Jason replied, though he knew he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Environmental factors, weather patterns. They were placed there, Jason, each one positioned by hand, and they'd all died at exactly the same moment, without a mark on them. Their hearts just stopped." The image of the mercenary from last week flashed through Jason's mind. The strange smile, the inexplicable death. He pushed the thought away. Coincidences, nothing more. An hour later, Jason sat across from Sokolov in interrogation room 13, a detail that would later seem significant in his nightmares if he lived long enough to have them. The room was his usual setting: stark concrete walls, a steel table bolted to the floor, a single overhead light. But today it felt different, smaller somehow, as if the walls were subtly pressing inward. "We know about the planned attack," Jason began, his voice level and professional. "We know about the sleeper cells. The only question is whether you want to do this the easy way or the hard way." Sokolov's smile widened. "Do you dream, Agent Winters? In those quiet hours when your conscience gnaws at you, what do you see behind your eyelids?" "We're not here to discuss my dreams," Jason replied sharply, though something in Sokolov's tone made his skin crawl. "But we are. We're here to discuss everything you fear, everything you've buried so deep you think it's forgotten. They remember you, you know, all the ones you've broken. Their pain echoes in the dark places, calling to others." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Jason felt a pressure building behind his eyes, like the onset of a migraine. But there was something else too, a sensation of being watched by something that lurked just beyond his peripheral vision. "No more games," Jason snapped, standing up. "You're going to tell me." "They're already here," Sokolov interrupted, his voice suddenly different, deeper, resonating with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. "You opened the door long ago, Jason Winters. With every soul you broke, every mind you shattered, you weakened the barriers. And now," he leaned forward, and for a moment, just a moment, his face seemed to shift, revealing something beneath the human mask that defied description. "Now they're hungry." The overhead light exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the room into darkness. When the emergency lights clicked on seconds later, casting everything in a red glow, Jason found himself staring into eyes that had become bottomless pits, reflecting horrors that no human was meant to see. And somewhere in the facility, a scream began. The scream came from Observation Room 6, 3 doors down from where Jason stood frozen in place. He recognized the voice, Agent Cooper. The sound cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, gurgling noise that made Jason's stomach turn. "You should check on him," Sokolov said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "He might need help, though I suspect he's beyond that now." Jason backed toward the door, keeping his eyes on Sokolov. The emergency lights cast crimson shadows across the prisoner's face, making his smile look like a bloody gash. The air had become so cold that Jason's breath came out in visible puffs. In the corridor, the emergency lights flickered erratically, creating strobing shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Jason drew his sidearm and moved toward Observation Room 6, every instinct screaming at him to run in the opposite direction. The door was ajar, leaking a thin stream of dark liquid into the hallway. When Jason pushed it open, the metallic smell of blood hit him like a physical force. Cooper lay sprawled across the observation console, his eyes wide and staring at something Jason couldn't see. His mouth was frozen in a rictus of terror, and dark symbols had been carved into his forehead. Not by any human hand, but as if they had erupted from beneath his skin. "Agent down in Observation 6, Jason spoke into his radio, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I need medical and security teams immediately." Only static answered him. He tried again, switching channels, but the result was the same. Then, through the static, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Whispers, countless voices speaking in languages that had been dead for millennia. The lights in the corridor began to fail one by one, darkness creeping toward him like a living thing. From somewhere deep in the facility came the sound of screaming. Not one voice now, but many. The emergency containment doors slammed shut with devastating finality, the facility going into automatic lockdown. Jason ran back to Interrogation Room 13, but he already knew what he would find. The chair where Sokolov had been sitting was empty, the restraints lying broken on the floor. On the concrete wall behind the chair, words had appeared, written in what looked like fresh blood. "The door is open. They are coming through." Director Powell's voice crackled over the facility's intercom, distorted but recognizable. "This is not a drill. All personnel evacuate immediately. Something's wrong with the... Oh God, what is that? Stay back. Stay." Her voice cut off in a sound that would haunt Jason's nightmares forever. The facility's main lights failed completely, leaving only the pulsing red of emergency lighting. In that crimson glow, Jason saw movement at the end of the corridor, a figure that might have once been human but now moved in ways that defied anatomy, its limbs bent at impossible angles, and its head twisted completely around to face him. "Running already, Agent Winters." Sokolov's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "But we've only just begun. Don't you want to meet them? The ones who have waited so patiently, watching from the other side while you did their work for them." Jason sprinted down the corridor, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. He passed more bodies, facility staff frozen in positions of terror, their faces contorted in silent screams. Each one bore the same strange symbols on their skin, glowing faintly in the darkness. The emergency stairs were at the end of the corridor. If he could just reach them, maybe he could make it to the surface. But as he ran, the corridor seemed to stretch, the distance to the stairs growing longer with each step. The walls began to pulse like a living thing, and faces pressed outward from the concrete. The faces of every person he had ever broken in this facility, their mouths opening in silent screams. "You see them now, don't you?" Sokolov's voice came from behind him. "All the ones you tortured, all the minds you shattered. They opened doors too, little cracks in reality. And now," a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, "now the doors are wide open." Jason reached the stairwell door and yanked it open, only to stumble backward in horror. Where there should have been stairs, there was only a vast, yawning abyss. Shapes moved in that darkness, things that had never known light, never known form. They reached for him with appendages that hurt his mind to look at. He slammed the door shut and pressed his back against it, breathing heavily. The red emergency lights cast moving shadows on the walls, shadows that didn't match any physical objects in the corridor. They crept toward him, taking on forms that grew more solid with each passing second. His radio crackled to life one final time. Through the static, he heard Director Powell's voice, weak and terrified. "Winters, the whole facility, it's changing. Sokolov, he's not human. He never was. We found records, ancient things. They've been waiting, using us, our interrogations, weakening the barriers between. Oh God, they're here." The shadows reached for him with dark tendrils that seemed to absorb what little light remained. Jason ran, no longer caring about direction or destination. The facility had become a maze of twisted corridors that defied physical space. Rooms opened into other rooms that shouldn't have been there. Gravity itself seemed to shift and warp. And everywhere he went, he heard them, the whispers of things that had waited in darkness since before humanity crawled from the primordial ooze. They spoke of patience, of hunger, of the thin barriers between worlds that were finally, irrevocably breaking down. Through it all, Sokolov's laughter echoed, growing less human with each passing moment. The thing that had worn Vladimir Sokolov's face was revealing its true nature and the reality of what it was threatened to shatter Jason's sanity. He found himself back at interrogation room 13, though he was certain he had been running in the opposite direction. The door swung open on its own, revealing darkness deeper than any he had ever seen. And in that darkness, something waited, something smiled. "Welcome back, Agent Winters," the thing that was no longer Sokolov said. "Shall we begin your interrogation?" The darkness in the interrogation room writhed like a living thing. Jason stood in the doorway, his legs refusing to move despite every instinct screaming at him to run. The thing before him had shed its human disguise completely now. What remained was a mass of shifting shadows and pale, glistening flesh that seemed to fold in on itself in ways that defied physics. "You've spent so many years breaking others," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers. "Did you never wonder what it would feel like? To be the one strapped to the chair, to feel your mind cracking under the pressure of truths you were never meant to know." The room's dimensions began to shift and twist. The concrete walls breathed like living tissue, pulsing with an unhealthy light that seemed to come from within. The air grew thick with the smell of decay and something else, an ancient, musty odor that reminded Jason of sealed tombs and forgotten places. "Your techniques are primitive," the entity continued, moving closer. "Physical pain, sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation, mere shadows of true torture. Let me show you what real breaking feels like." Suddenly, Jason was no longer standing in the doorway. He found himself strapped to the interrogation chair, steel restraints biting into his wrists and ankles. But these weren't the standard restraints. They seemed to be made of living metal that squirmed against his skin. The entity loomed over him, its form constantly shifting between Sokolov's human appearance and something far more horrific. Let's begin with your earliest memory of breaking someone. Thomas Reynolds, wasn't it? 2008. He lasted 6 days before he shattered. You were so proud of yourself. The room around them transformed, and Jason was back in that first interrogation. But this time, he was experiencing it from Reynolds' perspective. He felt every moment of fear, every spike of panic, every crushing wave of hopelessness. The entity forced him to feel everything his victims had felt, multiplied and amplified until his mind threatened to snap. "Stop," Jason gasped, but his voice came out weak and trembling. "Stop." The entity laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "But we're just getting started. 15 years of torture, Agent Winters. 15 years of breaking minds and spirits. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? That the universe wouldn't notice the doors you were opening with each shattered psyche?" The walls of the room began to bleed darkness, thick rivulets of shadow that moved against gravity. Each drop contained memories, not just Jason's memories of interrogations, but the memories of every person he had ever broken. They flooded his mind in a torrent of pain and fear. Through the facility's failing speakers, Jason heard screams and pleas for help from his colleagues, but the voices were wrong somehow, distorted and layered with inhuman sounds. He recognized Director Powell's voice among them, but it wasn't just her voice anymore. Something else was speaking through her. "Your entire facility is being consumed," the entity said, gesturing at the walls with a limb that constantly shifted between an arm and something far more disturbing. Every act of torture, every broken mind created fractures in reality, tiny at first, barely noticeable, but they grew, and through those cracks, we watched. We waited. We fed on the pain and fear until we were strong enough to cross over. The room temperature plunged so low that frost began forming on the walls. Jason's breath came out in white clouds that took shapes in the air, faces contorted in agony, mouths open in eternal screams. "Your superiors knew," the entity continued. "Not everything, but enough. They saw the patterns, interrogators at black sites around the world going mad, subjects dying in impossible ways. They knew something was happening, but they couldn't stop. The hunger for information, for control, was too strong, and now..." The entity's form expanded, filling the room with writhing shadows. Jason felt his sanity beginning to slip as he looked upon its true form. This was something ancient, something that had existed in the dark spaces between worlds since before humanity took its first breath. "Now you understand what true interrogation is," it whispered, its voice boring into Jason's mind like ice-cold needles. "Every technique you ever used, every method you perfected, pale imitations of our art. We are the original breakers of minds, shapers of fear, and you, Jason Winters, have proven yourself worthy of our attention." The entity reached for him with appendages that seemed to bend reality itself. In their touch, Jason felt the weight of eons, the cold of spaces between stars, the hunger of things that had waited in darkness since the beginning of time. "The only question that remains," it said, its voice now a symphony of terror, "is how long will you last before you break? How many hours of eternal darkness, of experiencing every moment of pain you've ever inflicted before your mind shatters completely?" The darkness closed in, and Jason Winters began to scream. But in this place, in this moment of ultimate horror, even his screams betrayed him. They echoed back with the voices of all those he had broken, a chorus of agony that stretched into infinity. And somewhere in what remained of the facility above, the last emergency lights flickered and died, plunging everything into a darkness that was far more than the mere absence of light. It was a darkness that breathed, that hungered, that had finally found its way into our world. Through the endless corridors of the black site facility, the entity's laughter echoed, a sound that would drive any human mind to madness. The barriers between worlds had finally broken completely, and what came through would change everything forever. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. Jason experienced an eternity of torment, feeling every moment of pain he had ever inflicted on others. The entity showed him truths about the universe that no human mind was meant to comprehend. He saw the spaces between realities, the ancient beings that had watched humanity since its inception, waiting for moments of weakness, feeding on suffering and fear. But something unexpected happened. Years of compartmentalizing trauma, of building mental walls to separate himself from the horrors of his work, had given Jason an unusual kind of strength. In the depths of his psychological torture, he found a spark of resistance. "You want to break me?" he gasped through blood-stained lips. "You'll have to do better than this." The entity paused, its ever-shifting form rippling with what might have been surprise. "Interesting. Most minds shatter completely by now, but you've built such strong walls in your mind. Walls made of guilt, of justification, of necessity. Let's see how they hold up against the weight of infinite darkness." The room around them transformed again, but this time it opened into a vast space that defied physics. They were suddenly suspended in an abyss that stretched forever in all directions. Ancient structures floated in the void, remnants of civilizations that had fallen to these entities eons ago. "Your species is so young," the entity whispered, its voice now coming from everywhere at once. "So fragile. We have broken entire worlds, Agent Winters. We have fed on the death screams of countless races. Your little facility, your primitive tortures, they were nothing more than an appetizer." But as the entity spoke, Jason noticed something. In its eagerness to break him, to show him the true nature of reality, it had loosened its mental grip ever so slightly. The living metal restraints holding him had shifted, responding to the entity's fluctuating attention. "You want to know what real fear is?" Jason asked, his voice stronger now. "It's not knowing that monsters exist. It's not even the pain or the darkness." He leaned forward, looking directly into the shifting mass of horror before him. "Real fear is knowing that you've become the monster." The entity recoiled slightly, and in that moment of confusion, Jason acted. He had spent 15 years learning how minds work, how they break, how they resist. He took every technique he had ever used, every lesson in psychological warfare, and turned them inward. He built mental barriers not of steel or stone, but of acceptance. "I know what I am," he continued, each word striking the entity like a physical blow. "I've tortured people, broken them, created cracks in reality, but I did it believing I was protecting something. What's your excuse?" The darkness around them wavered. The entity's form began to fluctuate more violently, its confidence cracking. "You cannot resist us. We are eternal. We are—" "You're parasites," Jason interrupted. "Feeding on pain because you can't create anything yourselves. And now you've shown me exactly how you work. Every secret, every weakness." The entity lunged at him with impossible appendages, but Jason was ready. He embraced every moment of guilt, every nightmare, every drop of blood on his hands. Instead of breaking under the weight of his sins, he used them as armor. The restraints shattered. Throughout the facility, reality began to stabilize. The twisted corridors straightened, the living darkness retreating before the harsh glare of emergency lights that suddenly blazed to life. The screams of the damned faded to echoes, then to silence. "What are you doing?" the entity roared, its form collapsing in on itself. "This is impossible." "I broke people by finding their weaknesses," Jason said, standing now, "and you just showed me yours. You need the fear, the guilt, the pain. Without it, you're nothing." He thought of every person he had interrogated, every soul he had damaged, but instead of letting the guilt destroy him, he accepted it, owned it, and in doing so, he turned it into a weapon. The entity thrashed in the void, its form unraveling. "You cannot undo what has been done. The doors are open. We are here." "No," Jason replied. "You're here because we invited you, because people like me created the cracks you needed. But guess what? I'm done being your door." The void around them began to collapse, reality rushing back in like a tide. The entity screamed in languages that predated humanity, its perfect trap turning into a prison. The very guilt and fear it had used as weapons became chains, binding it to a fate it had never imagined: containment. In the final moments, as the entity fought against the bonds of its own making, Jason saw Director Powell standing in the doorway of the interrogation room. She was bloodied but alive, her eyes wide with understanding. "The facility," she gasped, "it's stabilizing. What did you do?" "I accepted who I am," Jason replied, watching as the last traces of otherworldly darkness faded from the room. "And in doing so, I took away their power." The entity's final scream echoed through the facility, not in triumph, but in defeat. The sound of ancient evil facing something it had never expected. Redemption through acceptance. 3 months later, the facility was decommissioned. Official reports cited structural damage from an earthquake, but those who survived knew the truth. The interrogation rooms were sealed with concrete and steel, then sealed again with something older, symbols of protection carved by hands that understood the true nature of darkness. Jason Winters resigned from the CIA. His official statement cited personal reasons, but his final report, sealed in the deepest vaults of government archives, told a different story. It spoke of doors opened through human cruelty, of ancient things waiting in darkness, and of the fine line between monster and man. The last page of his report contained a warning. There are things worse than death, worse than pain, worse than any torture we can devise. They wait in the shadows between moments, feeding on our darkest acts, but they can only enter if we let them, if we become the monsters we fear. I know because I was their door, and I learned the hard way that the only thing more powerful than fear is acceptance, not of them, but of ourselves. The facility is quiet now, the doors are closed. But somewhere in the dark, they're still waiting, and they're hungry. And in the depths of the sealed facility, in a room that no longer exists in our reality, something stirs. It remembers, it waits, and sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, if you listen very carefully, you can still hear it whispering promises of power to anyone willing to become a monster. But that's another story for another time.